Hello everyone, and thanks so much for joining our session today. We're focusing on working on the workplace, ideas for creating a culture of belonging. I'm joined by a fantastic panel today. Hopefully Soraya will be back with us. We also have Rena, Mel and Gemma. These ladies all have a deep and diverse wealth of experience. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. If you have questions today, please don't forget to pop them into the Q&A tab on the side of the chat, and the Women in Games team will obviously follow up, and or you can find any of the panelists after the session and ask questions. I can see Soraya's back. Let's hope we can hear from her. So let's just quickly start with some intro. So a quick hello from me. I'm Liz Prince. I head up a business called Amicus. We're a specialist recruitment company for the games industry. I've been in recruitment since the early 1990s, having previously worked in tech, and before that I was a computer science grad. I've been a woman in games for 16 years, deeply committed to diversity and inclusion across the sector, and I work particularly to help inspire women and girls to consider the career paths that are available through an initiative that we founded in 2018 called G into Gaming. Rena, can I come to you for a hello?
Certainly. Hi, everyone. My name is Rena Goldenberg-Lynch, and I run a company called Voice at the Table. We are a diversity and inclusion consultancy, and my journey started with my passion of making sure that women's voices are heard around the tables everywhere. That's where I started. That was about 8-9 years ago, prior to which I did a very different job. I was a banking lawyer for 20 years. And prior to that, you don't want to know. It's a long story.
Fantastic, thank you. Mel, hello.
Hello, hi. I'm Mel Ward. I'm the head of production at Hangar 13, based in the Brighton studio. I've been in games for 20 years for my sins. There are more women now than there were then. The landscape is really very different, and I'm really passionate about the human side of production and making games and making sure that everybody has their place. So, you know, this panel is really important to me. It's something I'm very passionate about.
Gemma. Hi.
Hello. Sorry, I'm just trying to help Soraya so we can hear her. So I'm Gemma Johnson-Brown. I'm COO at Dovetail Games and on the Women in Games Executive Board, and I lead on our individual ambassador program. I've been in the games industry for nearly 10 years, and it was the first place where I felt I belong, and it's a place, and that's something I want to bring to everybody else that joins us.
Fantastic. Soraya, I can see you. I think you're still muted, unfortunately. Yeah, I'm not sure if any of the Women in Games teams can.
They're working behind the scene to try and
I'm sure.
Get you on.
But Soraya is also a colleague at Hangar 13, Mel. You're director of HR, I think, over there. So again, a wealth of experience. So I really hope that we can hear from you. But welcome, and thank you all for being here. It's fantastic to see you. So for our discussion today, we felt that there was a growing and important shift in emphasis from diversity and inclusion to towards diversity and belonging. So brought about really by the need to not just hire for diversity and then sort of absorb those new people into a workplace that was then just kind of set and how it was all the time. We definitely believe that people are looking for workplaces that allow individuals to be authentic at work, bring their whole selves, and certainly joining a flexible culture that's open to influence. So I thought today that we could explore a little more about what we mean by belonging, maybe what changes you've all experienced and driven that work to really affect culture for women, how we can get belonging to be at the centre of everything we do and how we make it stick. I definitely want to make sure that people listening today have things that they can take back to their workplaces and action and do. So let's start with what we mean by belonging. How do you see a culture of belonging? What does it mean to you? Rena?
Yeah, so belonging is really the flip side of the coin from inclusion. And I thought it might be useful to step back a couple of steps and start with the definition of diversity. What do we think? What do we mean when we say diversity? And to me, it's really about diversity of thought. It's how we interpret information, how we analyze it. And all of that is going to depend on who we are as a person. So our backgrounds, our experiences, our identities, all of that matters to make us very unique. But none of this is going to matter if we don't have an environment that knows how to tap into that individual diversity of the person and pull it out into the team. And that's what inclusion is about. So inclusion is about creating an environment that allows people to contribute authentically. So belonging is then, inclusion looks at the group, at the team, at the society or the workplace, and belonging looks at the individual. How does the individual, do they feel like they belong, like they can be themselves, like they're part of the family, and can they truly bring their authentic selves to the workplace? So you may have heard before the saying, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is about being asked to dance. So I see belonging as being able to say no if you don't want to dance.
Yeah, I think that's great. Mel or Gemma, do you have any thoughts and feelings about what belonging means to you?
I do. I don't know if you want to go first, Mel.
I can do. Oh, we lost Soraya. Shame. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, that was a really great description, actually, Rena. Thank you. That actually helped me just formalise it a little bit more. For me, I think just going a bit further, it's about an individual's own self-esteem in the workplace, I suppose, or outside of the workplace, and actually feeling like they are valued and they have their own sense of purpose as an individual rather than just as a team member or a certain discipline. So in work, it's about that, every single person feeling like they have their own individual contribution. That's what's important.
It's really interesting, isn't it, Rena? You and I were talking a few weeks ago about something to do with hiring, and someone said to us, you're not hiring a discipline, you're not hiring an artist, you're hiring a person. And that's so key, isn't it, to think about when you're bringing somebody into a team. You're not just focusing on the skills that you're trying to fill a gap for. Gemma, what does it mean to you, and also perhaps what should belonging look like for women in the workplace, particularly for you?
For me, belonging is about unconditional acceptance, that I feel secure, that I feel supported, that I accept you and you accept me, and that we can be different, and that's cool. The differences, they bring me joy and opportunity to learn and not fear. That's how I feel belonging. I think it's Brené Brown that said, best true belonging only happens when we present our authentic, imperfect selves to the world. And if you can love me with all my imperfections, then I certainly feel like I belong in a workplace.
Yeah, I think when we were just talking about interviews at the booth, and I think sometimes when people are being interviewed, that they feel that they've got to be a certain person, a certain way, and actually that's not the worst thing you can do, but you have to be and bring everything about yourself, don't you? Menopausal age 53 type of thing coming to the table. Not something that I might have been age 25 or whatever. Yeah. So
that's really, I just wanted to add one more thing to that. Actually. I'm representing Soraya here, actually, because this is something she said to me this morning. Was quite often when we're interviewing, or when one is interviewing, we talk about cultural fit as one of the things that we look at when we're interviewing. And I mean, that means lots of different things to different people, I suppose. But actually what Soraya was saying to me, and I found really interesting, is that we need to remove that kind of language when we're talking about interviewing, because by looking to find somebody that is a cultural fit, we're not allowing them to be their own self. not allowing them to bring their own individuality to the culture of a studio or a team. So that was a really interesting point. I really like that one. Very important.
It's a great point, actually, Mel. And if I may add to that, is so if we're moving away from a fit discussion, what do we look for? And what comes to me is values, because every organization has its values and you have to live them on a daily basis. So it makes sense then that we all align to the values of the company.
Yeah. I think that's spot on, Rena. We try to talk to, when we're thinking about job specs, we really do try to focus on shared values rather than cultural fit. I think that's definitely part of this change, isn't it? Yeah. So one thing I just wanted to pick up on, Rena, I know this is something that you've done work on. What about the differences that those that diversity brings, right? Is it smooth sailing for every organisation when they've got a whole set of different people with different viewpoints? How do we cope with that?
That's where the complexity comes in, because you have as many complexities as human beings in a room. So it's very difficult to navigate it. And I think what works well is allowing for that little bit of friction to exist, and in fact welcoming it into the process, because with a little bit of friction you get to the very best result. That said, you have to have a framework, if you will, a values-based framework where people know that they cannot cross the line. And the easiest thing for me to think about it is to say, you can be yourself so long as being yourself does not infringe of somebody else's right to be themselves. And it's a nice way, I think, or in a simple way to keep in mind of how is it that, what can I say? How do I express myself in such a way that I can be myself, but also respect somebody's right to be equally as authentic?
Perhaps some of the training opportunities and things are around having respectful conversations and knowing that that's something that actually does have to be worked on to really not just create but manifest that sort of feeling of belonging. So can we talk a little bit about sort of policies, ideas, things that you've experienced either in your studios or Rena as a consultant that really improve working culture? And I think specifically for women, I'd like to talk about first, sort of what's worked. I would also potentially like to think about anything that maybe hasn't worked, because maybe our audience can really sort of learn from both. Gemma, tell us what you think on that.
I was going to start from, I think that fundamentally you need very clear policies and processes in place that speak to inclusion, that are the guidelines for what HR and leaderships will follow, and to any sort follow it through.
Examples on that, Gemma? Anything specific you can share?
Having an equality inclusion process, and what is your grievance process if there are issues? How we resolve things informally, so people know what to expect if there are issues, and that issues are actually addressed and followed through. There's no point in having a process without following it through. Grasping the nettle is important.
So policies is probably the bedrock of what you're thinking about. Okay. Mel, any experience that you think, that's really worked?
Yeah, we last year we ran some unconscious bias sessions in the studio, and they were really great. They weren't mandatory. I would love to see them being mandatory actually going forward, because I think you were saying this earlier, a lot of what is said may be unintentional, or somebody doesn't realise that they're saying something that is offending somebody else. And so actually, I think from a cultural point of view, rather than a policy point of view specifically, it's really, really important to just kind of encourage more empathy, and doing that through things like unconscious bias training has really worked for us.
So what was the benefit to the studio from your perspective of that sort of training?
I think mostly in the way people will stop and think before they speak, I guess. The dev environment is quite fast and quite intense, and especially at times when coming up against deadlines or things maybe are just a bit harder, it's important and especially while we're all still at home, or mostly still at home, it's been really important for us. This is not just from a women in games point of view, this is generally, obviously. It's important for people to understand how to communicate respectfully. Not that I think we had an enormous problem before, but still, just so that, especially in those times of
when they're under pressure,
people don't exacerbate that unintentionally and make somebody else feel excluded or targeted in any way.
Yeah, understood. Rena, talk to us about things that work. You've got a lot of experience with sectors outside of games as well, so maybe bring some of that to the table.
Yeah, we'll do. So where to begin? Let's start with unconscious bias. So unconscious bias has been found to be a fantastic awareness raising tool, but not such a great tool when it comes to changing behaviors and changing culture. And I think that's where you probably need to go a step further and start this journey towards inclusive behaviors or building new habits, one of which is mitigating bias, of course. And that's something, so for instance, one of the things that we do and have been doing with a number of different studios is we have distilled inclusion into 8 different behaviors, inclusive behaviors, and they're things like, as you say, mitigating bias, empathy, better listening, understanding what motivates you, what your personal values are, etc., etc. And when you work on those individual behaviors, you start getting better. You start making fewer assumptions about people. You're becoming more curious. You're starting to appreciate. You're developing that affinity towards diversity, and you're more curious about that. So you're inviting that in. But it is a journey. It takes some time, and I know we'll speak about this before, but it's also about making sure that all of those conversations take place in the context of every single thing you do. It's about the promotion decision. It's about designing the game decision. It's everything that happens in the studio. You're practicing and building those new behavior habits. Now, one of the things that I found that also work is, we're talking about women in this case, what I also think works well is asking the women, what works for you, what doesn't, and then developing ideas along those lines. My word of caution there is that if you develop a policy or something specifically for women, let's not just open it to the women. Let's make sure that everyone has access to it. So we don't want to isolate or draw separate lines in the sand between women, men, whatever it is, any other gender, any other type of minority. So I'm, for instance, not a huge fan of leadership development solely for women. Inclusive leadership, yes, absolutely, for everyone. Just for women, it also sends a message about, well, we don't think you're good enough, so we'll give you a little bit extra practice, extra trainings, and this is not what it's about.
I think that's really interesting. I think on one of the sessions yesterday, someone asked in the chat about, the kind of what's out there for men. This was a woman asking the question quite genuinely, that I think she doesn't always want it to be special about her, because then she has that issue of, well, what about me, but from her colleagues? And I think that's absolutely spot on, isn't it? Making these policies completely inclusive. But they happen brilliantly to address a number of the issues that are more typically experienced by women.
Yeah, exactly. And I've seen it as well in organizations where they've developed and delivered fantastic leadership training solely to women. The women are fired up, they're encouraged, they're motivated, they go back to their desks and they encounter all the very same closed doors as before, because you hadn't addressed the culture. So that's the thing that needs to be done.
So taking your point of integrating, you have a great phrase, which is belonging on our minds. I love that. So how do we do that? What's I suppose, the top priority for making sure that belonging on our minds is everywhere in our organisation? Gemma, does it start with a women's group, or does it start with HR?
I think to Rena's point, it starts including everybody. It's not going to be a one thing, one size fits all. You have to make a continual effort, and it has to become part of your values and your culture. Looking at inclusivity as a behaviour, how do you demonstrate that? How do you encourage that? How do you recognise it? Making it a business goal. Making it a commercial thing that leadership then go, okay, I can see why having everyone feel a part of us is important. It needs to be ingrained in the culture.
I think, Lorena, that's something that you talk about, isn't it, with your clients, is actually about making it a business priority. Is that your top tip in terms of how to get the belonging on our minds?
Well, absolutely. From a leadership's commitment perspective, it has to be seen as the future. It has to be seen as a dominant business issue, which it is, to be honest, and that's my genuine opinion. And then the leadership has to obviously implement it and lead by example, by talking about it, by thinking about it. And as an individual tip, I think what really helps is to think the way that when we develop our games, for instance, we think about our audience, the individuals' avatars. What would they like? How do we want to develop this particular scene? How do we want to make sure that somebody, let's say Amy, who is Indian, how is she going to perceive this particular scene? That's exactly how I want to think about every decision that I make as a business. So I'm making this decision. How is Amy, who is from India, going to perceive this? Is this going to work for her? So having this constant thought process in your head, and every time you make the decision, or every time you make any kind of thought or communication, that helps.
Mel, is that your experience at Hangar 13 then? That obviously you've had unconscious bias training, so it's clearly on your minds. Is that a leadership level sort of commitment to inclusion and belonging?
Yeah, it is a leadership commitment, absolutely. But I wanted to make a point actually about how to put it. So as a studio, we have very strong ethics around diversity and inclusion and belonging. And we believe very firmly in it. We put a lot of effort into it, but that's only one piece of the puzzle. That's only one part of the fight. And we're a reasonably large studio with more than one project. And I feel I've been thinking about this quite a lot. So we need to make sure that our development practices and our project goals also support the studio goals. So it's okay saying this is what we believe as a studio, but then if a project is deadline after deadline and doesn't allow flexibility, there are certain behaviours within a project team, certain expectations on things like potentially on things like hours or whatever it might be, how many female leads there are on a particular project, or how many women there are in the dev side of it. All of those things also need to support it. We need to make sure that we are putting our money where our mouth is in terms of diversity and inclusion and belonging. And there's potential for disconnect. It's like with the best will in the world, games can be hard to make. And as a woman in her late 40s with 2 children, and I need to know that I have the same opportunity to be successful as somebody else, whoever that person might be. So I might have gone off topic slightly there, but I did want to get that in. I think it's really super important to make sure that we're holding hands. Like everybody in the studio is holding hands. And there's different types of leadership there.
Mel, you're absolutely answering the point about integration, aren't you? You know, because if you guys were interviewing for your studio, that's probably a really brilliant and very focused part of your process.
Yeah.
But perhaps if they went onto a project that maybe didn't have belonging on our minds, then that could be a disconnect for the new individual, and that's exactly what we're thinking about, isn't it? Yeah.
So there is more training around there that I think that, you know, there's different types of leadership, different types of training that need to be given to different groups, I think, to make sure that, you know,
it's very connected. Yeah. So are there any sort of specific initiatives, either within the studios or Rena, that you've experienced that maybe women have requested, and you've been able to bring in, or perhaps ideas that you're thinking about that you want to change? Mel, have you sort of anything that you think, oh, that was something that I know was asked for and we've done?
Well, we have women in games groups. We have them in our Brighton studio, and then sort of more broadly across our set of studios. They're great. They've worked better for us when we could do them in person. It's just nicer always, isn't it? You know, discussion groups, sharing of different topics, and asking different people to be involved. That's been really cool. But we can still go further, I think. The next thing that we need to make sure we're building into our discussion around women in games is our diversity within our women's group. That's kind of the next. Feel like that's the next way of really making sure that we will all belong, because we all have different needs and skills. And,
and I think those sort of resource groups are great, aren't they? For potentially, I think this was said on a panel yesterday, for kind of having that conversation in a safe space, and then allowing that to come up to leadership as an idea, as a policy. Gemma, is that how you've sort of integrated some ideas into Dovetail?
Yeah, our resource groups haven't embedded as what we want it intended to, and I think it's because it segregates rather than brings together too much. So we're looking more at an inclusion council to bring in that has people that are interested and passionate about inclusion, belonging, diversity to work together. Over the last few months, menopause policies are coming more and more relevant in terms of perimenopause and menopause, and how we as a company deal with that, how we all understand the changes that women go through and experience. You know, from my understanding, imposter syndrome is magnified tenfold through that period, and so that's really going to impact women in leadership roles and those that want to come forward. So that's been requested, and is an area where we're looking at how do we put that support in and spread knowledge throughout the company about what's going on.
And just enabling that open conversation, isn't it, as well? And I do think that sort of resource groups, at least that conversation starts somewhere and can then feed into the rest of the organisation and stop that. I think the session yesterday on women's health, the last taboo, was exactly that, wasn't it? You know, Rena, what have you seen maybe in other industries that women have asked for and that studios, organisations have implemented?
Yeah, and works really well. I mean, I'm going straight back to the basics here. Initiatives like mentoring and reciprocal mentoring and sponsorship, they work phenomenally well for women. And just, I'm not sure everybody's familiar with reciprocal mentoring. It's where you receive, as a more junior person, you receive mentoring from somebody more senior for half the session. And then the other half of the session, you turn the tables, and the more senior person receives some mentoring from you on whatever that may be. It could be social media, it could be what are we watching these days, what are young people watching these days, and it's a great way also to make sure that there is a bond, a link going up and down between the more senior and the more junior person, and of course between women and men who are more senior, who can share some ideas of how to network more, get promoted. This is a great way also to relate to some of the senior managers what doesn't work in networking, for instance, for women, because there are so many loopholes in networking that don't work for women, and also what doesn't work in the promotion process. Why are you putting so much emphasis on specific experience and this, that, and the other, when I can bring so much more and I can still do the job, but I don't have that specific experience? So those are the kind of communications that are all of a sudden become normal when you have those kind of reciprocal mentoring relationships. So they work really great. And of course, the other one is flexible working. So a lot of studios are going back to working in the office. The one thing about COVID, there's been lots of bad things about COVID, but the one thing about COVID, it's allowed women to work around their day. It has also backfired for a lot of women I know because they were then the sole carer in the household. But that kind of flexibility of arranging, so I run my own business, having done 20 years in the industry, running my own business, I work a lot more than I used to, but I work in a way that works for me. And it's amazing how much you can get done in less hours. So those kind of things I think are very useful and have worked.
Is there anything else perhaps that's changed, just thinking about Dovetail and Hangar 13, changed with COVID that is kind of part and parcel of this discussion about culture? What's changed? What's changed for you, Mel, at Hangar 13?
Well, everything's different, really. I think it's difficult to know where to begin, really. You know, on the plus side, flexibility for everyone, and you know, that making sure that we are able to maintain some of that flexibility going forward when maybe it wasn't so well supported before this is a real benefit. But in terms of culture, you know, it's much more difficult to keep to maintain the culture in the way we did before. So, you know, a lot of things we've done, but differently. But I do feel like maybe there was a lot more focus on that in the first 9 months to 12 months, just right across the board, not just Hangar, than there is now when we're kind of moving towards hybrid and it's a bit more normalised now, isn't it? And communication is a big, and empathy, just having empathy for people that you can't connect with on such a personal level is much more difficult.
I was just having a little sneak preview at the Q&A, just to make sure that there wasn't anything in there that, you know, we could quickly cover. There is a question that I know we're going to cover, but one thing there, Gemma, you might be able to have a think about with us. The idea of creating a charter or a set of communication or cultural rules, especially if it's a small studio, and then expanding it. You talked about policies. I think that's interesting. We've also talked about perhaps some of the differences that diversity can bring and how to manage that. Do you have any sort of specific guidelines for behaviour within the studio?
We have leadership behaviours and we have people behaviours that are linked to our values. And whilst skills, experience count, your mindset is a massive thing for us. Having that right mindset and focus is key. So from recruitment to our probation reviews through to our annual reviews, we pull back into behaviours. What behaviours do we expect from our people, from our leaders, and how do you actually demonstrate them? What are the tangible things you can see, so it's just not words on paper?
Kind of what does good look like is always a nice phrase, isn't it? Rena, we both met somebody who has an outstanding track record in diversity and inclusion over in Australia, and he started with hope nobody's offended, don't be a dick. But he switched that really quickly to be an example. And I think, Sean, just thinking about your question there, I think that's a really great place to start, be an example. It's like, what was the minimum criteria, and then start to go above it. One other thing for me, just to really quickly mention on that, is I think meetings and that sort of what's the word, like etiquette in meetings, to really make sure that everybody's voice is heard. And Mel, to your point, when you're on Zoom, Teams, whatever, it's actually more important, isn't it, to make sure that there's a bit of a real sort of charter of how to behave in meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, just one more point, because we're a multi-location studio anyway, so we're in California and Czech and here. And one thing that I don't miss at all is having 3 bunches of people in big meetings where not everybody is equal. And, some people have their back. There might be a bigger group in one location and a smaller, quieter group somewhere else. One thing that we're going to continue going forward in terms of meetings is having everybody equally represented on screen in a meeting. I find that is such a huge thing, actually, in terms of everybody having more of a voice and everybody having, and coupling that with expected behaviours and etiquette there is another positive that we can take from COVID times.
Yeah, it's kind of putting that respectful conversations really into practice, isn't it? 100%.
Yeah.
So the question that we were going to finish on has also been asked, which is great, because I think you probably know I really like things that people can do, real actionable things. So before we finish our time together, I think it would be important for everyone to hear an action, something that they could take and do now to try and improve their workplace culture. So kind of one piece of practical advice. Rena, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go with empathy. Mel, you mentioned it a number of times, and I think it is the foundation of inclusion and belonging. And what I mean by that is whenever I do anything or say anything, or if I react a certain way to somebody else's behavior or statement, the first thing I'm going to do, instead of judging or assuming, I'm going to try and put myself into their shoes and try and understand, why are they acting this way? Are there any other ways, other scenarios that could be true, rather than my assumption about that? So trying to become more empathetic. It's a lot easier to do with people who are like us. It's a lot more difficult to do with people who are not. And then if you don't know how they might be feeling, or you cannot put yourself into their shoes, then ask. So create that dialogue with them. So for me, that is the first step towards being more inclusive and bringing people more in.
And Rena, that's something that we can do as individuals. Do you have any a sort of flip side of that, which is maybe what a workplace can do as your kind of actionable thing?
Well, I've written down a couple of things, but I'm actually going to comment on something that maybe comes out of what's been said, and that's the basis on the basis that studios are very busy. We've got COVID, we've got the virtual communication that makes everything much more difficult, all the added stress and strain. I think it's important to understand that when there is that much extra strain on us, time, fatigue, whatever it is, that we all tend to revert to our old habits, old ways, and keep that in mind. So as a leader in particular, it doesn't have to be a leader, it could be a team member as well. But as a leader, I think it's really important to then mention that, to say, we are, this is very stressful, let's take a step back, let's take a deep breath and think about what really matters. We're all human beings here. Let's go back to basics. Let's, be more empathetic, whatever it is, or mention behaviors.
Amazing. Mel, what was on your mind when you think about actionable things that people can do in the workplace?
So I think as a studio, I think that it's incredibly important to make sure that your development practices support your studio ethos. There cannot be any disconnect between the two. Otherwise, it's not realistic, and you're doing your studio a disservice by not connecting those two. So I think that's a huge, big, high level thing. And then as a studio and as a project team or as a development team, you need to make sure that you're thinking of people as individual humans and not resources or skills. That's the other thing that is incredibly important. So they're two quite big cultural things there, but they kind of are the bedrock, really, for anything else that comes after.
Yeah, brilliant. Gemma?
Okay, so my advice to individuals is get involved, say hello to people, welcome people, try and have a conversation, give positive feedback when you see it, call it out and recognise people's accomplishments. It doesn't have to come from a leader or a manager. You can do it with your peers. Get involved in activities, whatever's going on, even if it pushes you out of your comfort zone. Look for people to guide and mentor you through those. From a business point of view, if you chair meetings, encourage involvement from everybody. So ask people if they've got questions on Zoom. I'll go through the room. In a physical room, I'll go round the room. I'll ask for people's ideas, because when you learn about introversion and extroverts, the extroverts will take up the air. They think by talking. Introverts think internally. So it's important for inclusion to give everybody that space to talk.
And it sounds as though, from your perspective as well, having the sort of bedrock of policy and things that set those values up as so everybody knows what to expect, everybody knows what good looks like. It feels like that really creates the foundation for everybody.
That's right, yeah.
Fab. We're just about out of time, and I'm so sorry that we didn't get to hear from Soraya as well, but I do thank her for her part in this panel, certainly in preparation and so on. I think it's been fantastic insight from everybody, and I really hope that everyone listening has got some food for thought. And as we said earlier, if you have any questions, I have seen a couple more in the Q&A, and I'm sorry we haven't got time to address them all. Women in Games will be going through all of that Q&A, but also we are all around at the expo. I'm certainly going to be on the G&T Gaming stand in a couple of minutes, and obviously everyone else is going to be either in networking or in booths as well. So please do come and track us down. And thanks again to Rena, to Soraya, wherever you are now, to Mel and to Gemma. Thank you so much.